New Zealand is one of the world's most liveable countries. It ranks near the top for democracy, safety, education, quality of life. So why are tens of thousands of New Zealanders leaving? And why does the OECD say the country's long-term convergence with richer economies has stalled? This documentary examines those two questions. Not the cyclical story, the recession that comes and goes, but the structural story that has been building for 25 years. Here is what the verified data shows, drawn from the OECD, the IMF, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and the Treasury. New Zealand's GDP contracted 0.5% in 2024. A recession is unusual, but it isn't the main story. The main story is why growth has been weak for so long, and why the institutions that monitor this most carefully are describing the challenge as structural rather than cyclical. The OECD projects 1.4% growth for 2026 and 2.2% in 2027. That is a recovery, but the OECD describes it as fragile, uneven, and dependent on external conditions. The unemployment rate peaked at 5.5% in late 2025 and early 2026. According to New Zealand Treasury confirmed data, inflation stood at 3.1% at the end of 2025, slightly above the Reserve Bank's 1 to 3% target band, and faces renewed upward pressure from higher energy costs. Now here is the number that most short-term coverage misses. New Zealand's labor productivity, measured as GDP per hour worked, sits at approximately $42. The OECD average is $54 per hour worked. That $12 gap matters because it compounds over time. Between 2015 and 2020, New Zealand's GDP per hour worked grew by 2%. The OECD average grew by 8% over the same period. The OECD's 2026 survey states explicitly that convergence toward the living standards of the OECD top half has stalled. That is not a description of a country in a temporary recession. That is a description of a structural challenge that predates any individual government and that no individual government has yet fully resolved. To understand New Zealand's economy, you have to understand its housing market, not because housing is a social issue, though it is, but because housing is an economic one. In 2000, the national median house price in New Zealand was approximately 170,000 New Zealand dollars. By December 2025, it was 786,977 New Zealand dollars. That is an increase of more than fourfold in 25 years. The house price to income ratio currently sits at 8.8 times the average household income. A ratio of around 3 is generally considered affordable. New Zealand's ratio is nearly 3 times that benchmark. Now here is the economic dimension that receives less attention than the social one. New Zealand has the second highest rate of investment in housing as a percentage of total national investment in the OECD, behind only Canada. New Zealand's housing share of total investment is 33.8%. The OECD average is 21.35%. Economists argue that when a large share of national investment flows into existing housing, relatively less capital is available for productive investment in businesses, technology, and infrastructure. Research published through the University of Auckland found a significant, moderate to strong, negative association between a country's housing share of investment and its productivity growth across OECD economies between 2015 and 2021. One interpretation consistent with that evidence. New Zealand's chronic low productivity and its chronic overinvestment in housing are not two separate problems. They may be two expressions of the same one. The Reserve Bank's own analysis shows that real per capita income in New Zealand hovered around 80% of the OECD average until the mid-2000s, then increased to over 95% by 2020, before falling back to approximately 90%. The improvement to 95% by 2020 demonstrates convergence is achievable. The subsequent reversal is what requires explanation. Here are the structural factors that economists broadly agree are contributing to New Zealand's productivity challenge. The first is capital market depth. New Zealand's capital markets remain shallow by international standards, according to the OECD's 2026 economic survey. Modest private pension assets, a compliance-intensive public equity market, and limited corporate bond activity all restrict capital availability. What that means in practice: innovative firms in New Zealand struggle to access the long-term financing they need to grow. The businesses most likely to drive productivity gains, technology firms, exporters, high-value manufacturers, face a financing environment that currently favors property over productive investment. The second structural factor is geographic isolation. New Zealand is genuinely remote. The additional cost of transporting goods and people relative to continental economies is real and persistent. This is not a policy failure. It is a geographic reality that policy can work around but cannot eliminate. Exports are dominated by agricultural commodities, dairy, meat, forestry, wool, where value is set by global commodity markets rather than by domestic innovation or brand differentiation. The third structural factor is the energy challenge. The OECD's 2026 survey identifies this explicitly. Despite high shares of renewable energy, electricity prices are structurally too high due to falling gas supply and underinvestment in firming capacity. High energy costs are not just a cost of living issue. They are a competitiveness issue for every business that uses electricity as an input, which is most of them. The fourth structural factor is the one that receives the least analytical attention. Consider what it means to be a recent graduate in Auckland. Your starting salary is lower than what you could earn for the same work across the Tasman. A first home costs nearly 9 times the average household income. The Reserve Bank reports that the New Zealand dollar now buys 26% fewer goods and services than it did 5 years ago. Australia suddenly stops looking like a different country. It starts looking like a different future. The Trans-Tasman travel arrangement means New Zealand and Australia effectively share a labor market. When wages and living costs diverge sufficiently, workers move. The IMF's 2025 Article 4 mission noted explicitly that over the medium term, economic growth will be driven by migration, while productivity growth is expected to remain modest if there are no significant structural reforms. An economy that cannot retain its skilled workforce faces a compounding challenge. The productivity investment made in education and training benefits the destination economy rather than the origin one. Here is how 4 different voices are interpreting this economic situation. The current government's position, led by National and Coalition since 2023, centers on fiscal consolidation, regulatory reform, and restoring business confidence. The investment boost depreciation allowance introduced in May 2025 is the headline structural measure. Foreign investment screening restrictions are being reviewed to attract capital. The government argues that the previous Labour administration's spending program left the fiscal position weaker than it appeared. The Treasury's half-year economic and fiscal update confirmed that the operating deficit is forecast to reach 13.9 billion New Zealand dollars in 2025 to 2026, deteriorating as a share of GDP from -2.1 to -3.0%. The opposition's position, Labour, is that fiscal consolidation during a downturn deepened the recession and that cuts to public services have disproportionately affected lower-income households. It is worth noting that the previous Labour government's Kiwi Build program, targeted at affordable home construction, under-delivered significantly relative to its stated targets. That is acknowledged across the political spectrum. The economic consensus among New Zealand economists centers on the diagnosis rather than the prescription. Productivity is too low. Housing is too expensive. Capital markets are too shallow. Geographic isolation imposes real costs. There is genuine disagreement about the weight to give each factor and the appropriate policy response. The overlooked perspective is the generational one. The households most severely affected by the combination of high housing costs, lower wages than comparable OECD economies, and a purchasing power that has declined 26% in 5 years, are those entering the economy for the first time. The emigration data suggests a significant proportion are choosing to leave. How does New Zealand compare with the countries this channel covers most closely? Australia, New Zealand's closest economic partner and the primary destination for New Zealand emigrants, faces structurally similar challenges: high housing costs, a commodity-dependent export base, a productivity gap with the most advanced OECD economies. The difference is scale. Australia's larger economy provides deeper labor markets, more diversified export revenue, and greater access to capital. Canada's experience with housing affordability is closely comparable, and Canada too has identified housing investment crowding out productive investment as a structural concern. In the UK, the productivity challenge is long-standing and well-documented. Britain's productivity per hour worked also lags the most advanced OECD economies, a problem described for decades as the UK's productivity puzzle. The underlying structural dynamic, capital flowing to property rather than productive investment, graduates emigrating to higher-wage economies, is visible across the Anglosphere. New Zealand's version is more acute because its scale is smaller, its geographic isolation is greater, and its capital market depth is more limited. Before the conclusion, the skeptics challenge. What evidence would challenge the primary thesis of this documentary? First, the geography argument. New Zealand's productivity gap partly reflects its industrial structure, not just its policy choices. A heavily agricultural economy will typically show lower GDP per hour than a financial services or technology economy. Some of the gap reflects sector composition as much as efficiency. One interpretation: the policy addressable portion of the productivity gap may be smaller than the headline numbers suggest. The evidence that would weaken this challenge: if sectoral productivity within comparable industries is also lower than OECD averages, which available analysis suggests is the case in construction and several service sectors, then the composition argument does not fully account for the gap. Second, the recovery argument. The current recovery may be the beginning of a genuine uplift, not just a cyclical rebound. The investment boost program, lower interest rates, resilient dairy exports, and returning tourism could together produce stronger than projected growth in 2026 and 2027. The evidence that would confirm this: if business investment rises materially in response to the depreciation allowance, and if the unemployment rate falls as forecast toward 4.3% by 2027, the recovery would have substance beyond the monetary easing cycle. Here is what can be stated with confidence and what cannot. What we know: GDP contracted 0.5% in 2024. Recovery underway, but modest and fragile. Labor productivity significantly below OECD average. Housing at 8.8 times income, among the highest in the OECD. NZ dollar purchasing power down 26% in 5 years. Capital markets shallow by international standards. Brain drain to Australia documented. Convergence toward OECD living standards has stalled. The OECD's own confirmed assessment. What we do not know: whether structural reforms will materially change the productivity trajectory, whether the housing market will return toward affordability or stabilize at elevated levels, whether the brain drain will reverse as the economy recovers, how quickly monetary easing will filter through to business investment. The most likely evidence-based interpretation is this: New Zealand is a genuinely well-governed, highly livable country that faces structural economic challenges that are real, documented, and long-standing. Those challenges are not the result of one government's choices. They reflect decades of capital allocation, geographic reality, and institutional inertia that no short-term policy cycle fully addresses. The current recovery is real. The structural challenges remain. Countries rarely become less prosperous overnight. More often, prosperity slowly drifts away when structural problems are postponed for too long. Whether New Zealand is approaching that point or beginning to reverse it is the question the next decade will answer. I'm the Anglosphere Report. The stories your local media won't connect. Tell me in the comments. Do you think New Zealand's structural challenges are primarily policy problems, or geographic ones that no policy can fully resolve? And what would evidence-based success look like in 10 years? See you next time.